And welcome back to the third and final video in this series on adding navigation to our wireframes, to our websites. We are making some pretty good progress here. We have 6 navigation items set up here inside of our nav container. We've added some spacing in between them using a margin right property. We've changed the text appearance a little bit. And most importantly, we're taking an opportunity to break free from the grid. And we're allowing each of these elements to be as wide as necessary to fit the respective labels inside of them. So this is an important demonstration of how you don't always have to completely abide by the grid in every single element you lay out. You can still use a grid, and the majority of your content can still abide by that grid, but it doesn't mean that each and every piece has to. And navigation is certainly one of those cases where you don't have to get everything in exactly the same width columns. Now, you'll notice that it just so happens that our first 4 pieces are kind of lining up here along our line here that ends the sidebar. It's off by a pixel or 2, but it's pretty close. And it almost looks like they are each a column wide. A piece, but that simply is because of the text we've happened to use inside of them. If I came back to Vim and came back to my HTML, and let's say for some reason I wanted my About section to be called something else, let's call it About the Site. Save that and come back to Firefox. Okay, so clearly now we're not lining up on that grid at all. We're just using whatever space we need to accommodate the content. Okay, so we've done some formatting, and in this segment we're going to go over just a few more ways that we can customize the appearance of this navigation. One thing we could do is change its position relative to the nav container that it sits within. So to do that, one thing we could do is come back over to Vim, come to our styles.css document, add a new selector. We're going to add a selector for the nav element itself. And we're going to give it a single property called text align. The text align can be set to left, it can be set to right, and it can be set to center. I'm going to set it to center. Save that and see what we get. Okay, so there I've centered my navigation. Now, what if I set it to right? Well, not surprisingly, if I do that, everything is going to line up there on the right. Why doesn't help go all the way to the end? Because I've set margin right. So if I'm going to align things to the right, I want to set my margin maybe to left. So rather than margin right 20, we'll come in here and say margin left 20. We do that, help is going to line up right on the side. But maybe we want a little space there. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. We can go back to margin right 20. And now we get a little extra space there on the side. Okay, what if we wanted the height of these regions to match the height of the background element, the nav container? Well, right now the height is only as wide as or only as tall, I should say, as it needs to be to accommodate the text, the padding. Just though, like I've set my height on the nav element, I can also set it on these elements. So we'll come back to Vim, and we're going to work with our nav li selector again, and we're going to add height. So we'll come up here, add in height. Now, I know that my nav element is 94 pixels tall. So that may be our inclination here. We'll make this 94 pixels tall. But if we do that, you'll notice that we actually end up getting it taller than we want. And that's because you have to remember padding is factored into the height. Well, we have padding of 10. And that means every side, top right, bottom left, is all going to be 10 pixels of padding. So between the top and the bottom, we have 20 extra pixels. That means if we want the height to match the nav element, we're going to change 94 to 74. Save that, come back and refresh, and now we're matching the height. What about our text? What if we wanted to align the text on the element here so it's exactly in the center. Well, that is a little tricky to pull off, and unfortunately, vertically aligning text is still something that's a little tricky in CSS. There are a couple of workarounds, a couple of hacks. One of them is to play with the line height property. And this only works, as you might imagine, if you have just a single line, one row of text. Otherwise, things are going to really start looking weird. But we only have one line, so we could try this, line height. And you just have to kind of guess at a value. We know we want it to be pretty large. Let's start with 50 pixels and see what that does for us. We'll refresh here. Okay, so that moved us down a little ways, but not far enough. How about 75? Or 70 for that matter. Okay, well that's pretty close actually. And we can fiddle with that to get it exactly right, but that's one method for vertically aligning that single line text in there. Now, the other thing we could do is drop this line, drop our height, and we could even come up to our nav, which we've defined further up here. Let's see, how are we defining that? No, we're not actually defining the nav in our styles. Let's come back to HTML and see what classes we have on the nav. So we've given it a weight 3, a grid 12, a height 94. What if we just get rid of this height 94? Let's delete that. We'll just delete the one word. Save and come back to Firefox. Okay, it appears as though it may be picking up a height from somewhere else. Or what could be happening is our unordered list is affecting the height. So let's do a quick troubleshoot on this. We're going to take our unordered list and just delete it for a second. Save that file and refresh. And okay, yeah, so now we don't see anything. If we came into our file here and just added a bit of scratch content, save it and come back. Okay, now we see there's our text on the side and our height is accommodating that text. So what that tells us is, without defining the height for this area, we're getting a bit of extra height at the bottom. Now that means that there's padding or there's a margin that's getting in the way. And I'm guessing it's a margin on our UL tag. Let's come back to Vim, back to our style sheet. We'll come down to that UL element. Oh, and we haven't actually defined it yet. So maybe if we add in a few properties for the nav UL, we can get this working. Let's start with margin, and let's set it to 0. Save that. We'll come back to Firefox and refresh. Okay, there we go. So the UL tag had a bit of margin on the bottom that was acting up on it. So by setting the UL margin to 0, we correct that problem. And now the height of our navigation region is stretching to be however tall it needs to be to accommodate our content. To show that that is in fact the case, if I come back to my style sheet, change the padding for my nav li elements. Let's double it from 10 to 20. Save it and refresh it. Okay, now we have 20 pixels of padding all the way around, and now the height of our nav element has updated to reflect that. So let's go back to 10 because I think that does look a bit better. Save that and refresh. What you can see happening here, though, is a process where as we begin modifying our layout, getting more precise about how we want things to appear, we're going to begin stripping out some of those classes that we added during the wireframing process. And it could begin with removing some of the height classes because we want the height to be influenced by what's actually contained in the element. Or it could involve stripping out some of the weight classes because we don't want those gray background colors showing through. We don't want, for example, this dark gray area. So we come back to Vim and we come into our HTML file, come to our nav HTML element, and I'm going to drop the weight class, save it, come back, refresh, and there we go. We just get rid of that background color. The nav element is still there. It still serves a structural purpose on our site, but it's not actually visible anymore. This is a very common process to go through as we move from wireframes to a more fully designed site. And in doing this, to my eye anyway, this margin here on the right makes a little bit less sense if I get rid of that background color. So I'll come back to Vim again, and I'll make one more change in my CSS file. I'm going to change margin right back to margin left. Save it and do a quick refresh on that. Okay, there we go. So there you have it, a couple of tricks on setting up navigation. Of course, we'll need to come back at some point and actually set up our links, but you get the basic idea on how all of that works. So that's navigation, and that's a little bit on how to convert wireframes into more fully formed, fully designed pages. And that's a topic we'll pick up in another tutorial.